There is a moment most Americans of a certain generation remember with startling clarity. The moment they walked into a store, a diner, or a gas station, handed over a handwritten application, and waited to find out if someone was willing to pay them for their time. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some grand rite of passage announced with fanfare. It was just Tuesday. But that Tuesday changed everything, because from that point forward, you weren't just a kid anymore. You were a worker. And in mid-century America, that happened to almost every teenager, usually somewhere between the ages of 14 and 16, before a driver's license, before a serious girlfriend or boyfriend, sometimes even before high school was fully underway. The teenage first job wasn't a quirk of certain families or certain circumstances. It was simply what you did. To understand how universal this was, you have to understand how differently Americans once thought about adolescence itself. Today we tend to think of the teen years as a protected stretch of time, a kind of extended childhood where the primary job is school, and everything else waits. But for most of American history, and certainly through the mid-20th century, that wasn't the prevailing view at all. Young people were expected to contribute. Not because families were heartless, but because the whole culture operated on the assumption that useful work built character, that earning your own money taught lessons no classroom could, and that idle hands were genuinely something to worry about. Parents who sent their 14-year-olds out to find work weren't being tough. They were being practical, and they were passing on a value system that had shaped American life for generations. The jobs themselves were wonderfully ordinary. They didn't require resumes or references or background checks. They required showing up on time, being reasonably polite, and doing what you were told. For boys in the post-war decades, the paper route was often the first taste of real employment, sometimes starting as young as 11 or 12 and stretching well into the high school years. You memorized your route the way you memorized your multiplication tables, and you collected payments door to door at the end of the week, making change out of a canvas bag and learning fast that some customers would tip and some would make you wait on the porch in the rain before coming to the door at all. It was a masterclass in human nature, delivered one neighborhood at a time. Grocery stores were another pillar of teenage employment, particularly for boys in the 50s and 60s. The role of bag boy, or sacker, depending on what part of the country you grew up in, was an institution unto itself. You stood at the end of the checkout lane, you watched how the cashier rang things up, and you developed opinions about the right way to pack a bag, paper over the canned goods, bread on top, eggs always last. Regular customers became familiar faces. You learned their names, or at least you learned their preferences. Some tipped. Most didn't. The job paid modestly, but the real currency was something harder to quantify. You were part of the working world now. You had a schedule and a uniform and a manager who expected you to show up. Girls had their own well-worn paths into the workforce, and chief among them was babysitting. We've talked on this channel before about babysitting as its own kind of institution in post-war America, and it's worth noting again here because it occupied a unique place in the economy of teenage labor. It was work that happened mostly off the books, arranged through church directories and neighborhood networks, paid in cash that never saw a tax form. A girl who had a reputation as a reliable babysitter could keep herself booked on weekend nights from the time she was 12 years old straight through high school. She learned to manage small children, to handle emergencies calmly, to be the responsible adult in a house even when she was still technically a child herself. It was informal, yes, but it was also genuinely demanding work. Beyond babysitting, teenage girls in the 50s and 60s found their way into five and dime stores, soda fountains, and department stores in growing numbers as those decades progressed. The woman behind the cosmetics counter, the girl selling penny candy and greeting cards at the Woolworths downtown, these were not adult positions that teenagers stumbled into accidentally. They were entry-level roles that store owners deliberately filled with teenagers because teenagers were reliable, affordable, and grateful for the work. By the early 1960s, major retailers had come to depend on teenage labor in ways that shaped how their entire service model operated. The economics of it were straightforward and, by today's standards, almost quaint. A teenager working part-time in the early 1960s might bring home $5 or $6 for a full Saturday. A paper route might net a few dollars a week. Babysitting paid 50 cents an hour in many places, sometimes 75 cents if the family had more than 2 kids and you were expected to put them to bed. These were not wages that were going to fund a college education or a car purchase outright, but they weren't meant to. They were seed money. They were the beginning of understanding that money had to be earned before it could be spent, and that how you spent it said something about who you were. Some kids saved. Some kids spent every dime at the record store or the movie theater the weekend they got paid. Most did a little of both. What the money bought mattered less than the act of earning it. That was the point that every parent of that era seemed to understand instinctively, even if they didn't articulate it in quite those terms. A teenager with a job was learning punctuality, because a boss expected you at a certain time and didn't particularly care about your reasons if you were late. They were learning to manage conflict, because sooner or later a customer was going to be rude to you or a coworker was going to be difficult, and you were going to have to figure out how to handle it without quitting and without losing your temper. They were learning, in the most concrete possible way, that adults operated inside systems of obligation and expectation, and that entering the adult world meant entering those systems too. The social dimension of the teenage job was something that often gets overlooked when we look back at this era, and it deserves its own moment of attention. For many teenagers, the job was their first real sustained contact with adults who weren't their parents or their teachers. The man who managed the grocery store had a completely different relationship with you than your father did. He was neither friend nor authority figure in the familiar sense. He was something new, an employer, a person whose respect you had to earn through performance rather than through love or institutional power. Teenagers who worked alongside adults learned to read those relationships, to understand when to speak up and when to stay quiet, to develop a professional self that was related to but distinct from their home self. That was not a small thing. The restaurants and diners of the post-war decades were particularly rich environments for this kind of social education. A teenager bussing tables in a busy diner on a Friday night was navigating a fully operational adult world in real time. There were waitresses who had been doing this for 20 years and had no patience for sloppiness. There were cooks who ran the kitchen like a military operation. There were customers who were charming and customers who were exhausting and customers who were somewhere in between. The teenager in the middle of all that was absorbing an education in human behavior that no classroom curriculum had ever figured out how to replicate. By the time you hit the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the landscape of teenage employment was starting to shift in ways that would have lasting consequences. The fast food industry was exploding, and it created something genuinely new, which was a mass employment sector built almost entirely around teenage labor. McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, and dozens of regional chains that have since vanished were hiring teenagers by the thousands, standardizing the experience in ways that earlier teenage employment never had been. You wore a uniform. You followed a script. You operated within systems designed to be repeatable and auditable. It was a different kind of first job than the paper route or the grocery bag or the neighborhood babysitting gig. It was more impersonal, more regimented, and also, notably, more accessible. You didn't need to know anyone. You didn't need a neighborhood network. You walked in, you filled out an application, and if you were willing to show up and follow the rules, you had a job. The mall era of the late 70s and 80s extended this transformation further. The specialty retail stores that filled those gleaming suburban shopping centers depended heavily on teenage employees, and they offered something that earlier teenage jobs often hadn't, which was a degree of social cachet. Working at the record store or the clothing boutique or the sporting goods shop wasn't just a paycheck. It was an identity. You were an authority on the products you sold. Regular customers sought your opinion. You got the employee discount. You knew the new releases before anyone else did. These jobs carried a kind of status within teenage social hierarchies that the bag boy job at the grocery store never quite managed to achieve, and that status made them intensely competitive in a way that earlier teenage employment had never been. What's remarkable, when you look at this whole arc from the paper routes of the 1940s to the mall jobs of the 1980s, is how consistent the underlying value remained even as the surface details changed completely. The teenager going to work was doing something that American culture had always expected teenagers to do. They were demonstrating, through action, that they were capable of operating in the adult world. They were building a version of themselves that existed outside the home and outside the school, a self that was accountable to someone other than a parent or a teacher, a self that stood or fell on what they actually produced. There is something about that era of near-universal teenage employment that people who lived through it tend to remember with a warmth that goes beyond a nostalgia for the specific jobs. It's a warmth for the feeling of being trusted with real responsibility at a young age. Of being told, implicitly, that you were capable of handling something that mattered. Of learning, through the ordinary texture of a shift at a diner or a Saturday morning on a paper route, that the adult world was something you could manage, something you could enter and navigate and eventually make your own. That feeling, that particular confidence, was what the first job actually gave you. The paycheck was just the receipt.